Have you ever woken up one morning, looked at the person beside you, and felt estranged? Not because you no longer love her, but because you no longer recognize who you are in this relationship. We are often taught to be patient, forgiving, and to preserve love at all costs. But what no one tells us is this: some relationships are not meant to be maintained, but to be ended. You were once strong, confident, and disciplined. Now you tread lightly in your own home, measuring every word for fear of provoking anger. You second-guess your own emotions, apologize for things you don't understand, and slowly lose your sense of self. This is no longer love. It is a form of control. Stoicism teaches us this: no one has the power to destroy our inner peace unless we hand it to them. And if a relationship is draining your spirit, your discipline, and your dignity, it is time to ask, why am I still here? 1. She manipulates emotion, making you doubt yourself. One of the most insidious and subtle forms of emotional manipulation in a relationship is when the other person convinces you that your pain is a sign of weakness or irrationality. No harsh words are needed. There's no yelling or blame, because the behavior often comes cloaked in gentleness, sometimes even disguised as sincerity, making the manipulated party unaware that their thoughts are being controlled. It often begins with moments that seem harmless. You say, "I don't feel comfortable when you do that." And instead of being heard, you're met with surprised skepticism. "Really? I didn't think it was such a big deal." Once is nothing. Twice, 3 times, and you start yielding, questioning yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. But over time, your pain is reframed as a personal flaw. You begin to believe you are the problem. This isn't just disagreement. It's a systematic invalidation of your emotions, gradually severing you from your inner experience. You start fearing emotional honesty because each time you speak up, it's dismissed or diminished. Worse yet, as you grow quieter and ask for less, the other gains more control in the relationship. A common tactic in this manipulation is the logic trap. Every time you express a feeling, you're dragged into an argument where your thoughts are dissected, twisted, and flipped until you're no longer sure if what you feel is real. Say you're hurt. They forgot a special day. Rather than apologize, she says, "You expect too much," or "Why do you always need validation?" These aren't questions. They're traps, meant to make you question the validity of your own feelings. Eventually, you become easy to lead, partly because you don't want to create conflict, and partly because you've lost the ability to tell what's real and what's imagined. In psychology, this is called self-gaslighting. When you begin dismissing your own emotions because you've been conditioned to believe you're overreacting. From a behavioral standpoint, this often pairs with something called intentional emotional delay. She might respond with silence, avoidance, or "we'll talk later," yet the conversation never happens. You're left in limbo. No closure, no explanation, no clarity. Your feelings suspended, unresolved, and silenced by your own effort to move on quietly. Another tactic is subtle comparison, meant to belittle your emotions. Phrases like, "I don't think most men would care about something like that," or "My friend's boyfriend is way worse." These aren't meant to comfort, but to make you feel petty or irrational. Over time, you become passive, afraid of being too much, and start apologizing for feelings you had every right to express. One of the gravest consequences is inner disconnection. Prolonged manipulation doesn't just silence your voice, it numbs your ability to feel truthfully. You grow detached from yourself, indecisive, disoriented. This doesn't only affect love, it spreads to work, social ties, even your sense of independence. In the Stoic view, emotions are not weaknesses to be denied. They are vital data from within, pointing to our needs, values, and boundaries. When someone makes you question that data, they're not just breaking your trust, they're dismantling the very foundation of your selfhood. Love is not a space where true feelings must be censored. Love is not a battleground of winners and losers. And certainly, love is not a place where you must doubt your own reality just to keep the peace. If someone makes you feel wrong for speaking your truth, they are not loving you. They are reshaping you into a version that fits their comfort and control. And in that shape, you are no longer yourself. You become a quiet, hesitant shadow, exhausted from normalizing your own pain. In an unhealthy relationship, emotion, meant to be a bridge for connection, can be weaponized to dodge accountability. These aren't authentic expressions, but strategic manipulations. Tears, anger, silence, all used to derail conversations and avoid facing consequences. The clearest sign of this is when an issue is raised to be resolved, but instead of listening, the person shifts the focus to their own emotional reaction. Say you express, "I felt disrespected when you canceled last minute," and they respond with tears or defensiveness. "Why do you always think the worst of me?" Or, "I feel attacked when you criticize me." Now you're on the defensive, consoling them, and the real issue is erased. This is a tactic called emotional diversion. When someone habitually uses emotional outbursts to control dialogue, you become conditioned to avoid difficult subjects. You fear truth will cost you. Anger, coldness, guilt, inducing tears. Over time, you don't speak freely. You edit yourself to avoid punishment. This leads to self-censorship and a slow betrayal of your values. Another method of avoiding responsibility is passive-aggressive silence. When you raise a concern or show hurt, they respond not with words, but prolonged silence. No explanation, no resolution. You're left uneasy, questioning yourself, feeling guilty for reasons you can't name. Eventually, you're the one to reconcile, even though you were the one wronged. They sidestep responsibility and come out appearing righteous. Weaponized emotion can also surface through dramatizing every minor conflict. A gentle critique becomes a crisis. Crying, threats of leaving, accusations that you no longer love them. These are not pure feelings. They're tools of dominance, meant to overwhelm and guilt you into submission. In psychology, this is known as emotional blackmail, using intense emotion to coerce the other into surrender, even when they've done nothing wrong. It builds a power imbalance where one side always feels responsible for the other's volatility. Worse, over time, the manipulated begin to believe the other's distress is their fault and lose their moral compass. Another hallmark of this behavior is repetition. These aren't rare emotional spikes anyone might have. This is a patterned response. Each time accountability looms, the person defaults to emotional offense. Eventually, you stop bringing up issues. You endure. You manage it internally rather than speak up. The relationship stops being built on fairness. It becomes ruled by fear and compromise. Beyond emotional harm, this behavior distorts what love and compassion are meant to be. When you always let it go to keep the peace, always yield emotionally to avoid conflict, love stops being a place for authenticity and becomes a stage where you perform the role of someone sensitive, patient, silent enough not to upset anyone, even when you're being hurt. From the Stoic lens of agency and character, this is a form of inner avoidance. Instead of facing faults, taking responsibility, and growing, which requires courage and maturity, the manipulator opts for a shortcut, creating emotional chaos to claim temporary moral high ground and using it as an excuse not to change. They bind the other through guilt, pity, and obligation. This is not love. It's an unfair trade between compassion and control. Over time, the manipulated person enters a state of chronic anxiety, unsure when they'll next cause hurt, unsure of the other's limits, unsure whether they're even allowed to speak their truth. This breeds emotional imbalance, slowly robbing them of the ability to decide, to self-validate, and to manage emotion. All core pillars of a healthy individual. 2. She stopped trying and took you for granted. In the early stages of a relationship, care often flows naturally, freely and consistently. It's in the goodnight texts, the small acts like making coffee just the way the other prefers, or the attentive gaze that listens fully when you speak. These seemingly minor gestures build trust and emotional intimacy. One cannot love without caring, and cannot feel loved without receiving intentional attention from the other. Yet in some relationships, that care fades. It doesn't disappear suddenly. It withers quietly through skipped gestures, interrupted conversations, the absence of simple check-ins like whether you've eaten or how your day went. At first, it's easy to overlook, dismissing it as busyness, pressure, or the idea that this is what long-term love looks like. But when indifference becomes habitual and goes unchecked, it sets a new default for the relationship. This indifference shows up in many forms. It may be a vacant look when you share something meaningful, a lukewarm response when you try to plan quality time, a half-hearted presence during moments that once mattered. She no longer asks what weighs on your mind, nor notices the subtle changes in your mood or behavior. The relationship shifts from a deep exchange to a parallel existence, two people living side by side, yet no longer truly connected. More strikingly, indifference isn't absence. It's presence without substance. You may spend the whole day with her and still feel like she's in a world where you no longer matter, no longer count. This is not giving each other space. It is not being seen as a person to be understood, but as an accessory passively existing in her life. A common consequence of this state is that the other begins to question their worth in the relationship. When signs of care vanish, what remains is not just disappointment, but a spiral of doubt. Did I do something wrong? Am I still attractive to her? Does she still love me? Even without a single hurtful word, silence, neglect, and a lack of initiative speak volumes. They quietly signal emotional exclusion. Psychologically, repeated neglect wounds self-worth in invisible ways. Reaching for someone who no longer reaches back breeds the ache of abandonment and a sense of inadequacy. This often leads to quiet surrender, lowered expectations, avoided confrontation, and a desperate normalization of distance by saying, maybe it's just a phase. But all the while, the emotional gap grows. And what was once mutual effort becomes a one-sided struggle. Even more subtle is the form of indifference masked by normalcy. She may still speak politely, share daily updates, appear outwardly engaged, but there is no depth. This is disguised indifference. No clear signs of conflict, only quiet detachment. It leaves the other confused, unable to pinpoint the problem, suffering in silence without enough evidence to question what's happening. In long-term relationships, romance and attention may not look like they once did, but the difference lies not in form, but in effort. One can be busy, tired, or unromantic and still care deeply. Through a glance, a touch, a simple, "How are you feeling?" True concern always finds a way. In contrast, sustained indifference is the clearest proof that one person has stopped trying. A troubling sign is when indifference becomes the default response to your efforts. You share your pain. She replies with silence or indifference. You suggest a getaway. She declines without explanation. You seek closeness. She's busy or cold. These aren't isolated reactions. They're habitual. At this point, the relationship no longer runs on emotional connection, but on routine or fear of change. In any healthy relationship, connection demands effort from both sides. It's not just an emotional duty. It's a continuous act where both people commit to nurture what they've chosen. Yet there are situations where the effort is one-sided. The other has emotionally checked out, yet still expects and demands you to keep going as if nothing has changed. This often begins with small but clear signs. No more initiating texts, no more shared plans, no more attention to detail, like anniversaries, your quirks, or moments that once mattered. Still, they expect you to be romantic, attentive, and react positively to the little they do. This breeds a quiet, lingering emotional imbalance. The one no longer trying is rarely questioned, while the one who still tries constantly feels like it's not enough. You might plan a special evening, and she responds with indifference. You suggest a trip to rekindle things, and she feigns disinterest. Yet if you forget a minor detail or misread her mood, you're labeled careless, insensitive, or no longer in love. The contradiction is this: one person withdraws emotionally, yet keeps the right to judge and demand. She no longer invests in deep conversations, but expects you to understand her silence as fatigue. She stops showing appreciation, but if you become distant, she accuses you of changing. This creates a cycle where you're responsible for both your emotions and hers, not just to maintain connection, but to soothe the growing silence. A common result of this dynamic is emotional exhaustion, not just physical effort, but a soul-deep fatigue. Always being the one to save the relationship burdens you with emotions not solely yours. In every conflict, you're the one to apologize, to adapt, to repair, while the other stays silent, resentful, and solutionless. This also breeds a loss of clarity in one's role. When you're forced to get it right just to keep the bond intact, you begin to doubt your feelings. You ask, "Am I expecting too much? Is it fair to want her to try too? Or maybe she's going through something. I should be understanding." These questions seem compassionate, but over time, they erode your standards for what a healthy relationship requires. At its core, this stops being a partnership and becomes emotional servitude. One person striving for two, while the other watches and judges. Often, the one who's stopped trying isn't even aware. They may simply assume you'll always be there, always keep going. But that assumption itself reveals a disregard for the emotional value of the other, and left unchecked, it leads to deep fracture. What makes this harder to see is that outwardly the relationship appears intact. You still dine out, still post photos, still attend events together. But surface appearances cannot reflect the depth of a relationship if beneath it lies a structural imbalance. The one who keeps trying often feels most alone because no feeling is returned, no connection reciprocated. From a practical standpoint, when one stops trying yet expects the other to maintain the relationship, they've redefined emotional responsibility as emotional obligation. That is a far cry from healthy commitment. Instead of, we both preserve this because we value it, it becomes, you must do everything to keep it alive. I just have to remain here. This is the moment one must see. Effort without reciprocity is not love, it is depletion. And without honest conversation to restore balance, without mutual change, this dynamic will slowly erode trust, self-respect, and the safety love is meant to offer. 3. She always plays the victim to avoid facing the truth. In a healthy relationship, conflict is seen as natural and essential for growth. Each time disagreement arises, both individuals must take ownership of their part, however small, to reflect, adjust, and mature together. Yet in some unhealthy relationships, there emerges a common but hard to identify pattern. One person consistently casts themselves as the victim in every conflict to avoid confronting their own faults or responsibilities. This behavior isn't always loud or dramatic. It may manifest quietly, subtly, even as a habitual reflex. Whenever tension arises, this person immediately shifts the focus of the conversation from their wrongful act to the hurt they claim to feel, as though your reaction to a negative act becomes the greater offense. For example, if you point out that she said something inappropriate in front of friends that hurt you, instead of acknowledging it, she might say, "I guess I can never make you happier," or "You're always trying to find fault in me." The original issue, her behavior, gets buried, and you're suddenly cast as the one causing harm, simply for expressing your honest emotions. Over time, this creates a dysfunctional pattern of communication. Whenever something upsets you, and you speak up, you are held responsible for the emotional distress she displays, instead of jointly examining whether her behavior was appropriate. This repeated reversal eventually conditions you to self-censor, fearing that any feedback will be labeled as criticism, rejection, or cruelty. Gradually, you begin to filter your own thoughts and emotions, not because you feel nothing, but because the relationship has trained you that every time you speak up, another conflict will erupt, one in which you're always to blame. She might say, "I got angry because you never listen," or "I lied because you're too controlling, and I was scared." These aren't explanations. They're justifications to avoid the truth that she also holds responsibility. This constant shifting of blame disrupts the balance of the relationship. Responsibility no longer rests on both shoulders. It falls squarely on yours. You must manage not only your own emotions, but also hers. Emotions weaponized as a shield against honest conversation. Meanwhile, she assumes the role of the wounded party to maintain moral superiority. Because in this dynamic, the one who is hurt is automatically right, and the other must be wrong. This not only harms the other person, it distorts how problems are viewed within the relationship. When one party is consistently exempt from accountability, while the other must always apologize or make peace, the relationship stops being a partnership and becomes a skewed system of emotional power. In such a system, the one who holds the right to be hurt also holds the power to define what's right and wrong. Another common form of turning conflict into your fault is the redefinition of events to serve her interests. For instance, if you react strongly to her publicly criticizing you, she might say, "I was just joking. You don't know how to take a joke." Or, "If you hadn't acted that way, I wouldn't have had to say it." In both cases, instead of owning her actions, she reverses cause and effect, so that you feel like the reason behind her misconduct. The troubling part is that this can go on for years without being named, because it doesn't involve yelling or overt insults. On the contrary, it's often paired with tears, soft words, or wounded silence, all of which make you feel you should calm down, avoid adding pressure, and be the one to make peace. Accept that role long enough, and it becomes the default operating mode of the relationship. From a behavioral standpoint, this is more than avoidance. It's a deliberate emotional defense designed to protect a self-image and shift the burden of resolution to the other. It doesn't stem from a desire to grow together, but from fear of confronting one's own flaws, and thus, every tool of communication, from logic to emotion, is used to deflect rather than face the truth. In any relationship, hurt is inevitable. Clashes of thoughts, expectations, and feelings can cause misunderstanding, pain, even rupture. Yet there's a clear difference between genuine hurt that calls for healing and the use of emotional pain as a means of control, deflection, or manipulation of another's compassion. Playing the victim in this context is not mere sensitivity or fragility. It is a strategic form of communication, a proactive defense where the aim is to induce guilt in the other person and make them feel obligated to compensate for the emotional injury being displayed, even when, in many cases, it was the victim player who initiated the harm. Typical signs of this behavior include an immediate emotional outburst when faced with truth or critical feedback. When criticized, the person neither denies nor defends with reason. They shift instantly into sadness, disappointment, self-doubt, or emotional collapse. Familiar phrases include, "I know I'll never be good enough for you," "You must think I'm a burden," or "I don't even know if I matter to you anymore." Linguistically, these phrases appear self-blaming, but in practice, they force the other to stop the dialogue and begin emotional rescue. The conversation shifts from the conflict itself to saving the person showing distress. The one who tried to speak with honesty now must put aside their own feelings, suspend logic, and soothe the storm. Over time, this creates a one-way silence. The one who displays emotional pain dominates the tone, while the other is conditioned to submit whenever negative feelings arise. A predictable consequence is that the other loses the ability to respond honestly. Every time they want to speak, they must first assess how much hurt their words might trigger, even when those words are rooted in truth or goodwill. Communication becomes tense, defensive, constantly adjusted to match the emotional tolerance of the other. This is a form of internal censorship that often goes unnoticed until the relationship no longer feels safe for authenticity. Beyond words, The use of emotional hurt as manipulation appears in symbolic actions too. For instance, after an intense argument, instead of expressing feelings directly and seeking resolution, the person withdraws entirely. Prolonged silence, avoidance, or posting cryptic, negative social media messages about the relationship. These actions don't resolve anything. They create silent pressure, pushing the other to make peace or take blame, just to restore temporary stability. Over time, this becomes a recurring cycle. After each conflict, one retreats into emotional withdrawal. The other must chase to repair, regardless of who was truly at fault. From a behavioral lens, using hurt as a tool may not always be intentional, but it still reshapes emotional power in the relationship. The person expressing distress gains control, not by threats, but by making the other feel emotionally responsible. Empathy, while essential in love, if exploited, becomes the groundwork for an unbalanced dynamic, where one is excused from regulating their emotions and the other is forced to constantly adapt. What makes this behavior particularly complex is how easily it can be rationalized. The one using it may not believe they're manipulating, so they may think they're just sensitive, needing to be understood, or wanting their partner to listen. These seem like fair and human desires, but repeated in every difficult situation, they become a shield blocking honest, balanced dialogue. In the long run, this behavior strips the relationship of mutuality. One person becomes the emotional caretaker, always preserving peace, apologizing first, adjusting themselves to avoid reactions. The other assumes their feelings are paramount and that their hurt is enough to shut down any debate. Over time, this not only exhausts communication, it erodes the fairness and trust that a relationship depends on. 4. She crosses boundaries and dismisses your limits. In any enduring relationship, intimacy and emotional connection must coexist with respect for personal boundaries. These boundaries are not merely physical. They are mental and emotional lines that help each person maintain autonomy, inner calm, and a distinct identity even within closeness. The need to be alone, to have quiet, to do what one loves, or to retreat for restoration is not a sign of detachment. It is a healthy expression of emotional maturity. Yet in some relationships, this rightful need is neither acknowledged nor respected. In fact, it is often treated as a threat. The other party, here the woman, may react negatively whenever you express a desire for personal time. Instead of understanding, she responds with suspicion, reproach, or demands that you explain yourself. Wanting a quiet evening to read, a weekend without shared plans, or simply some undisturbed solitude might provoke emotional projections like, "Are you trying to avoid me? Is there something you're hiding?" Or, "Don't you want to spend time with me anymore?" This isn't merely insensitivity. It is a refusal to acknowledge personal boundaries, a denial of your right to private space without permission or justification. Over time, if this repeats, you begin adjusting your behavior to prevent conflict. You start limiting solo activities, giving up quiet moments, or postponing self-care just to ease her discontent. This is a form of silent surrender, where you gradually sacrifice your inner needs for the appearance of harmony. The deeper consequence is the erosion of self-governance. When you no longer control your time and rhythm, you lose clarity on what nourishes your spirit. You live in a constant state of readiness, physically and emotionally, and any attempt to withdraw, however temporary, comes with guilt or the fear of being misunderstood. Another dimension of this behavior is the invalidation of your rightful need for rest. There are moments when you simply want silence, not because you're hiding anything, but because you need to recharge. But rather than empathy, you're met with suspicion or sulking. She might say, "Is spending time with me really that exhausting?" Or, "People in love should want to be close." These words, while not overtly hostile, apply subtle pressure, pushing you to suppress your needs just to prove your affection. This inverts the moral order, where the one setting a boundary is the problem, and the one crossing it is just asking for love. Disrespect for your personal time can also take the form of invading your solitary activities. Whether you're listening to music, readings, working, or exercising, things that center and restore you, she interrupts, demands attention, or grows displeased if you don't respond immediately. Over time, your personal space no longer feels like refuge, but like a battlefield for potential conflict. From a practical view, when someone cannot retain personal time within a relationship, they become emotionally overloaded, easily agitated, unfocused, and estranged from themselves. They start to feel guilty even for doing what's necessary for their mental health. This leads to symptoms like chronic fatigue, anxiety, and a loss of personal direction, having grown too accustomed to living by someone else's schedule and emotional demands. It must be said, intimacy is not fusion. Being in love does not require total merger of time, space, and emotion. In fact, the healthiest couples are those who understand that true connection arises from respecting one another's independence, not from constant proximity. When a woman consistently denies your need for space and privacy, she is not just disrupting your comfort. She is endangering the foundation of your autonomy and identity. If left unaddressed, this behavior distorts how both partners perceive each other and confuses the essential boundary between ours and mine. In a mature relationship, setting personal boundaries is essential for preserving respect, individuality, and psychological balance. Boundaries may relate to time, space, behavior, or what is and isn't acceptable in the relationship. They are not signs of control, but healthy signals that ensure personal values aren't unconsciously or deliberately violated. Yet when someone repeatedly tests, ignores, or overrides those boundaries, the relationship begins to shift from cooperation to an imbalance of power. A common example is when you've clearly expressed discomfort about her maintaining intimate contact with an ex. Your stance isn't controlling. It reflects a need for emotional security and mutual respect. But instead of engaging constructively, she responds with defiance or dismissal. She might say sarcastically, "Are you jealous of a ghost?" Or snap, "I don't like being told what to do." Then, the behavior continues, more openly as if to assert, "I reject your boundary as valid." This is more than a difference in opinion. It is a denial of personal boundaries, an unwillingness to accept that you have the right to define what aligns with your inner values. When this happens repeatedly, you find yourself defending your legitimate emotions, questioning whether your limits are as unreasonable as she claims. Over time, this self-doubt can lead you to relax or remove those boundaries, not because you want to, but to protect the relationship, even at the cost of self-sovereignty. Another form of boundary violation involves intruding on your clearly defined privacy, reading your messages, interfering in your social life, or asking controlling questions about personal choices. When you push back, instead of apologizing, she might say, "If you have nothing to hide, why keep secrets?" Or, "I just want to make sure you're not deceiving me." These aren't attempts to understand. They're tactics to rationalize intrusion by shifting the emotional burden onto you. Eventually, this behavior creates a warped emotional ecosystem where the one who draws boundaries is blamed for creating tension, while the one who violates them is cast as having a valid reason. This pattern is common in manipulative dynamics. The person who keeps crossing the line avoids accountability and redirects attention to your reactions. So the issue is no longer her behavior, but "You're too sensitive," "You're too rigid," or "You don't trust me." Boundary testing also shows up in everyday details. You ask for quiet to work. She turns up the music. You request that a sensitive topic not be discussed in public. She jokes about it in a crowd. When you react, she shrugs. "It was just a joke. Didn't think you were serious." Or, "I thought you wouldn't mind." These might seem accidental at first, but when they recur, it's clear she either doesn't respect your boundaries, or worse, she's testing your resolve to defend them. One of the long-term effects of this behavior is the erosion of your ability to assert boundaries at all. When you're forced to repeatedly explain, defend, and justify your limits instead of having them respected, you begin adjusting to avoid conflict. Eventually, you dismantle those boundaries yourself, just to escape criticism. This is a quiet, chronic wound that slowly strips you of the sense of being yourself within the relationship. What must be recognized is this: boundary violation doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it stems from unchecked habits, compulsions to test, to control, or to affirm power. But regardless of the intent, the result is the same. Emotional power becomes imbalanced. The one who disregards boundaries doesn't adjust behavior out of respect, but out of learning just how much you will tolerate. 5. She disrespects your time and tests your limits. In every social relationship, especially romantic ones, time is one of the most tangible and concrete expressions of care. When someone chooses to spend time with another, it's not merely a matter of scheduling. It's their way of showing that the other person holds value, deserves priority, and is worthy of mental presence. Therefore, when someone repeatedly cancels plans, arrives late, or makes last-minute changes without good reason, the act isn't merely inconvenient. It directly undermines the sense of being respected and valued in the relationship. In the early stages of a relationship, being a few minutes late or rescheduling due to unavoidable circumstances is often forgivable. However, when these behaviors become habitual, frequent, without valid explanations, absent apology, or effort to make amends, they begin to reflect a more serious issue: a disregard for time and shared commitments. When a woman repeatedly arrives late, changes plans at the last minute, or forgets a meeting without warning or response, she sends an unspoken message that your time is not as important as her schedule. If this pattern continues, it creates a subtle but persistent psychological strain. You begin bracing for cancellations, delays, or disruptions, instead of simply anticipating someone who shows up with presence and care. What should be joyful encounters become sources of anxiety, restlessness, and recurring disappointment. And if you express this, she might respond with indifference. It's just a few minutes, or you're overreacting. A notable consequence of repeated cancellations and tardiness is the erosion of implicit relational agreements. Each meeting is not just about time. It is about presence, both physical and emotional. When someone fails to honor the agreement to show up on time, or alters plans at the last second without clear explanation, they withdraw from responsible presence, leaving the other feeling deprioritized and unseen. Another key point is that last-minute cancellations don't just waste actual time. They interrupt emotional preparation. When you anticipate a meeting, you're not just watching the clock. You've readied yourself mentally, adjusted your emotions, even nurtured hopeful expectations for connection. A sudden disruption cuts through that entire rhythm, and if left unacknowledged, it breeds a quiet sense of disrespect and disregard. From a behavioral lens, if the other person remains mild and accommodating, never setting firm boundaries, the one who cancels often may not realize the damage done. They might normalize lateness or last-minute changes and make less and less effort to be on time or uphold commitments. In some cases, your frustration may even be turned against you as proof that you're too sensitive, too demanding, or not flexible enough, rather than a signal that something needs to change. Another important element is that inconsistency in keeping appointments reflects emotional instability within the relationship. Someone who regularly shifts plans or misses meetings without concern often lacks a clear commitment to emotional consistency and safety. When you don't know if she'll show up, cancel last minute, or disappear entirely, it becomes impossible to trust her reliability or sense of priority. Over time, such behavior doesn't just hurt the relationship, it chips away at your self-respect and sense of being valued. When you're constantly made to wait, adjust, or sacrifice your personal time due to another's inconsistency, you no longer feel like an independent person with valuable time, but like someone tethered to the other's whims. In a romantic relationship, mutual engagement and emotional commitment are the pillars of trust and stability. Each person needs to feel understood, reciprocated, and seen with mutual respect. Yet in some cases, one partner avoids transparent connection, instead using delay tactics, lateness, prolonged silence, or distracted behavior as a subtle means of testing the other's boundaries. This behavior doesn't always look like outright rejection or confrontation. It often manifests as lack of response, lack of initiative, or deliberate distance, meant to observe how you'll react. For instance, when you send a message or propose a meeting, she may take a long time to reply without valid reason, or respond briefly and coldly. There may be no direct conflict, but the disconnection lingers, forcing you to interpret her silence. Eventually, repeated waiting and unreciprocated communication lead to emotional insecurity. You start wondering if you've done something wrong, if she's upset, or if the relationship is quietly shifting. It is in this uncertainty that the person using silence or delay gains subtle control, because you're now the one adjusting behavior, emotions, and expectations just to maintain connection. This use of silence or delay as boundary testing rarely comes with honest explanation. It prevents you from asking directly or seeking clarity without risking being labeled too sensitive or too demanding. If you speak up, her response might be, "I was just busy, it's not a big deal." Or, "Why do you always need everything so black and white?" These replies discourage you from setting boundaries and reinforce your passive role in the relationship. Another form of this pattern is the deliberate lack of initiative. For example, you're always the one scheduling time together, sending the first message, or suggesting shared plans. If you stop doing so to gauge her effort, the result is often silence or delay, until you give in and resume your usual role. This becomes her way of measuring how far you'll bend, how much you'll carry the emotional weight for both. Psychologically, this is a test of your threshold. How distant can I become before you start chasing? When she sees you still texting, despite delayed replies, still planning outings despite her lack of interest, she learns she doesn't need to change a thing for the relationship to function. This is an emotional imbalance where one side overfunctions to maintain stability, while the other maintains control through distance and nonchalance. One of the most damaging effects of this behavior is the erosion of your trust, not just in her, but in your own emotional perception. You begin doubting yourself. Am I being annoying? Am I expecting too much? Is her silence a warning sign I haven't noticed? These internal questions make you reactive rather than proactive, cautious instead of candid, defensive instead of open. The danger is that this behavior can be easily rationalized. She might say she needs space, is busy, or doesn't express emotions well. But when these reasons become constant excuses for lack of response, lack of presence, and lack of initiative, they stop being personality traits and become deliberate strategies to maintain emotional leverage. If left unchecked, this dynamic leads to a clear imbalance. The one who once tried to stay connected begins to shrink, waiting, initiating, avoiding conflict, compromising. This is not emotional equality. It is a strategic absence turned into subtle control. We cannot control others, but we can always control how we respond. This is not merely a beautiful Stoic quote. It is a compass for navigating all relationships, especially those beginning to fracture from within. I was once in a relationship where I constantly yielded, enduring lateness, indifference, and even staying silent when my boundaries were crossed. At the time, I believed I was being patient out of love, but in truth, I was compromising my personal values. The first thing I learned from Stoicism wasn't to be strong, but to be clear-eyed, clear enough to distinguish between genuine love and manipulation masked as emotion. When a woman repeatedly violates your boundaries, uses her pain as a tool of control, or makes you feel guilty for having reasonable needs, this is no longer love. It is the erosion of your inner integrity. We do not walk away out of anger, but because we understand that peace cannot exist in an environment that constantly makes us question our self-worth. Redrawing boundaries, stepping back from toxicity, is not failure. It is an act of self-respect, and one every Stoic must learn and embody. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future content. And always remember, peace is not something others give you. It is something you choose to keep every day. See you in the next video.